Hi everyone, it's Ren here. Welcome to my Irish room, guys. Hope you're well today. Today we're going to take a little break from the discussion of INFJs and religion, INFJs and spirituality. Not that I will stop with the series, because I'm still exploring and interested in exploring further. But let's take a little break, shall we? And today we're going to take a little detour and retrace just some thoughts I was having recently. And these thoughts are about comparing INFJs and INTPs, particularly in this case along the area of stubbornness, sticking to one's viewpoints. How does one manage that? How does one justify that? How does one situate oneself in respect to others? This is in the context also of thinking that there's so many similarities between INFJs and INTPs, particularly when you take subtypes of INFJs are high in TI and tend to be more on the valuing of intellect side of things, which is not the case of all INFJs, but is the case of some INFJs, and it's probably the case of a overrepresented segment on the online. Because the more online you are, the more you're likely to be alone in front of your computer, the more likely you are to be engaged in intellectual, somewhat intellectual conversations on, community websites of all sorts, of community apps, and therefore the more likely you are to engage in some form of cerebral interaction. So I like to compare the two types. I mean, I don't know if this will be useful to you in terms of figuring out whether you're an INFJ or an INTP. I'm pretty sure the INFJs are confident they are INFJ, and similarly for INTPs. But this may throw some light. This may spark some conversation, disagreements, possibly, because this is based mostly on my observations. Not necessarily on any theoretical investigation at this early stage. Now, before I move on with my topic, don't forget, you can get my books, my recently published books, The Ecstatic Soul, which is the book on the INFJ personality if you're interested in a heady kind of theoretical approach that tries to go deep into the consciousness of the INFJ. Check the links below, less than $10, almost 100 reviews on Amazon, so plenty to make up your mind. And my more recent novel, The Infinite Castle, Kafka, Dostoevsky, Camus, Existentialism, Modernism. If you're interested in supporting my work, it's also less than $10, and it's a very nice product. Really supports the channel also. Rumor has it that the main character is an INFJ. What kind of INFJ? I've already given it away in many videos in the past, so I shall not repeat it here. So yeah, check these out. Don't forget you can support me on Patreon as well. I find that Patreon is really, really helping with the running of the channel. So, if you can help anywhere from €3 a month, that's deeply appreciated. And thank you to my patrons. So, one thing that, INTPs and INFJs have so strongly in common, that's quite noticeable that they have in common, if you're a little bit observant, is that they outwardly manifest caring about other people's opinions in order to assert their own. They do that in different ways and to different degrees of obviousness. I would say that if you observe INTPs superficially, you will notice that phenomenon happening a lot less than it happens with INFJs. You could attribute this to INFJs having, a higher a tribal function, an FE function that is higher in their function stack, and leave it at that. But so far, you've just pointed out a hierarchy of functions. You haven't really explained anything. But certainly there is something to do here with the fact that for INTPs, FE is an inferior function, and for INFJs, it is an auxiliary function. I don't know if I would want to call FE a tribal function, but I will certainly call it a social function where intersubjectivity, intersubjectivity is a strong kind of dimension of FE as explored in this book. Intersubjectivity is a cardinal aspect of the FE function. Intersubjectivity does imply that the strengthening and assertion of your subjective positions are going to be partly defined by other subjective positions that you're interacting with. That applies to INFJs, also applies to INTPs. At the same time, both types are capable of being quite stubborn. It's a little bit of a cliche, maybe, to say this, but really, if you were to look at a population of 100 INFJs or 100 INTPs, the proportion of people who are going to exhibit traits of being stubborn is higher than for most other types, possibly with the exception of INTJs, perhaps in their own way INFPs, but beyond that, you're entering less stubborn territory, possibly also because S-types, being more down to earth and grounded on average, not by any means all the time, tend to find easier ways to negotiate compromises. Maybe ISFPs are stubborn as well. Either way, INFJs and INTPs, they're up there. Top 5 most stubborn types without the shadow of a doubt. In different ways, and despite the fact that they care about the opinion of their intersubjective social partners. I think sometimes people confuse appearing cocky, intellectually cocky, for instance, and being intellectually independent, intellectually self-sufficient, at least in terms of how you justify your positions to yourself. Someone who justify their positions entirely to themselves, I would tend to maybe look at with suspicion. I look at them, with suspicion to some extent, because you don't want to be completely solipsistic. You do want to consult other people. But there is an interesting contrast sometimes in INFJs, and perhaps even more so INTPs, between appearing very confident in their intellectual positions, sometimes cocky, sometimes mocking of others' inferior intellects. And that's obviously more so the case online. Let's keep this in mind, but there's still an interesting sample to look at. And the fact that underneath it all, there is one of the reasons why this is done in the first place, why these little cocky performances are delivered, is precisely so that the target audience, or the target's, the destination, in terms of the audience, the public that's being targeted, can be measured, can be assessed, can be sized up in order to reassure the originator of the cocky comment or the self-confident assertion that really actually they're probably doing okay. You see that quite a bit with INTPs online, where there can be that attitude at times, but at the same time you sense that it is very important for the INTP to manifest that attitude, test reactions, absorb the reactions, and make sense within their TI system that, after all, yes, they were correct to hold that position. One of the important differences between the INFJ stubbornness and INTP stubbornness is, I think, that if you like, so along one dimension, INFJs will be frustrated, more obviously frustrated that other people some people don't agree with them, right? They might find it harder to accept, they prefer when people agree with them. It's the nature of a hierarchy function. INTPs don't care as much whether people agree with them. They still care about what people think, but it's easier for them to define themselves against people who disagree with them. In other words, they've got the TI framework. TI framework has been arrived at in many ways internally. It needs to be externally sanctioned, verified somehow. FE, albeit inferior, has to kick in and do its justification work. But you can have situations where an INTP will say, okay, this person or this bunch of people don't agree with me. They've explained why. I was so determined that they're relatively dumb. So actually, this is reassuring to me that I'm on the right path. So they can arrive at a form of externalized reassurance through a negative assessment of an audience. Always keep in mind that the negative assessment of an audience versus a positive assessment of an audience betrays exactly the same dependence on there being an audience to interact with, which is why I'm saying INTPs are just as dependent on these other people, even if it is to negatively assess them. INFJs find it harder. They tend to be a little bit rattled when too many people disagree with them, despite what they might want to say. And another aspect that is an interesting further distinction or sub-distinction, I think, is that when the INTP is justifying through a negative assessment that the tribe is wrong and therefore that, they're right, they themselves are right to follow their path because the tribe is wrong and has shown it to be the case. You have INFJs who do follow that path as well, who are able to negatively assess. It's less easy for an INFJ due to higher FE, but you do meet plenty of INFJs online who are in that mode. Sometimes can make them hard to distinguish from INTPs or from INTJs, maybe more so from INTJs, because really when you're familiar with, different types, you can't really, it's very easy to tell apart INTPs and INTJs. But in any case, and INFJs can attain sort of a form of comfort and reassurance about their position through negative assessments of other audiences. Less easy, but they can do that. But I think they do that differently, I think that what you see with the INTP is that often, and again, I'm putting the point in somewhat exaggerated fashion just to make things quite straightforward. I think an INTP will often put the fault on people being either too dumb or intellectually lazy. At any rate, it will be, I think in a way they will perform a TI projection on people where the failure that they perceive in these people, whereby these people end up being wrong, is a failure in proper deliberation, because TI is the deliberative function. These people might not have TI high up, but that's how the INTP's grid functions onto people. It applies to any type. That's how types function. You don't have a choice. You interpret the world and other people through your own interpretive grid. Fusion of horizons, concept from Hans Gadamer, if you're interested in exploring this concept. The fusion of horizons, very, very interesting concept from hermeneutics that I would love to explore at some point in the context of personality and typology discussions. Hans Gadamer, Gadamer, that might be of interest to you. Often typed INFJ, actually maybe at some point I should try to see if I can type him. I don't know if he's an INFJ, I know his work a bit, but anyway, something to bookmark. The INTP will often see, if you like, an intellective deficiency as the source of the tribe being wrong, so that they can be reassured by them themselves being right because they went through the effort of building their TI system or their TI framework internally, as they are kind of almost programmed to do by default in terms of the quality and texture of their very consciousness. INFJs not so much. It's not very often the case that INFJs will put the onus on this kind of failure of intellect, whether it be ability or will, failure of will, such as, again, a laziness of intellect, something that can really happen. But INFJs might use that as a piece of their reasoning in the first place, superficially, but it's never what's going to drive them to eventually find the self-justification that they're looking for. Whether it ends up being in terms of alignment with other people through positive assessment, or in terms of putting themselves in contrast to other people through a negative self-assessment and having maybe a little bit more of a martyr syndrome. You don't see a lot of INTP martyrs. They don't justify themselves in this way. you'll see that among INFJs. And what is significant about the martyr syndrome, if you allow me to use this phrase, is that it is there's a significant moral and ethical dimension to it. So I think that, if you like, the failure that is potentially going to be perceived by the INFJ, or at least assessed to be such, is not a cognitive failure. INFJs will tend to assume people actually get it, you know. It's partly because INFJs don't have TI as high as INTPs, so they don't perform that TI projection that INTPs perform. In some sense, you have to realize INTPs are always thinking and internally deliberating. This is what they do. This is how they are programmed. ICP do that as well. INFPs and ISFPs do that also, but along the FI dimensions. Different approach, you know, but still. INFJs don't do that. INFJs are not always constantly deliberating. Their mind is kind of this ocean, has waves, you know, it's much more colored indeed, and ani textured. The deliberation enters when there is a conscious need and decision for that to happen. So they tend to, you know, again, applying the projective grid, they assume people get it. Unless the person is really blatantly, you know, idiotic, I guess. But they will often tend to negatively assess people's ability to act on their cognitive judgments. Weakness of the will, if you like. Or not just a weakness of the will, but a straightforward bad or evil disposition, a sinful disposition. And here we enter, or we re-enter the domain of the religious and the religious vocabulary, which we will touch upon again when we, you know, return to that series about INFJs and spirituality. Notice how INFJs often end up justifying their position, or justifying how they can make sense of people not being on their wavelength when it's a very difficult thing to process. If there is a negative assessment of others to make the judgment easier and the situation easier, it's not often going to be like it is for INTPs and for INTJs and ENTJs to an extent, that of a cognitive accusation. It's often going to be in terms of an accusation of failure of the will, weakness of the will, or sinful predispositions, or, if you like, evil predispositions, or malevolent predispositions. Notice a lot of Jordan Peterson's language in this regard. Malevolence is much more common than negative assessments on the basis of intellect. Now, Peterson's not an INFJ, but he's an ENFJ, most likely, which ENFJs and INFJs have that in common. Time is running out. I might explore this a bit more detail tomorrow, depending on your comments. So yeah, until tomorrow, have a very nice afternoon, guys. I'll see you then. Don't forget my Patreon. Really helps. Take care. Bye-bye.